Hello, adult Sunday schoolers. How are you? Sorry for recording this lecturette pretty late on this Saturday. I've had a very eventful day at the annual gathering for the NCNC UCC, and I can't wait to tell you all about it. But I didn't want to wait until tomorrow, of course, to upload this lecturette. And because I'm recording it so late, this will be not only the lecturette that hopefully you can glance at least partially before class, but it will also be the class recording for tomorrow. So this is the recording that you can watch before, optionally, but this will also be the class recording that all of you should use for Sunday school on June 19. So actually this date here should say June 19. Let me correct that right now. And I hope all of you can hear me. I'm trying to keep my voice relatively audible, but not too loud because I am in kind of a communal space. So I hope that this volume is loud enough. And if anything, hopefully you can just raise the volume on the TV in the social hall if my audio isn't so loud. So our topic for today is the Christian ethics of media. And of course, we have limited time, so it's only going to be an introductory survey, maybe even the introduction to the introduction, because this field, or rather subfield of Christian ethics, is so relatively new and rapidly evolving in response to the many forms of media that are proliferating in our society, in our digital world, especially as we move toward the so-called metaverse. Don't worry about what that is for now. I just wanted to put it out there to contextualize the kind of landscape that we are dealing with when we're talking about media. So let me share the slides, or rather enlarge them. Here's an outline for not only this lecturette, but also this Sunday school class. So again, you should be watching this on June 19, but if you can, feel free to watch it anytime before class. And surely, since it's on YouTube, you can watch it anytime after our class. First, we're going to define the ethics of media. What is this subfield in Christian ethics? Second, we're going to ask why we as Christians should discuss media. So we're going to reflect on why we should biblically engage questions about the use and even the misuse of media in the 21st century. Third, we're going to use our three major branches of Christian ethics to generate arguments about how we ought to use media, from social media to smartphone use, and those will be the main forms of media that we'll probably focus on, because a lot of us, if not all of us, are using Facebook and Facebook Messenger and our smartphones. Here's mine. And lastly, we'll just sum it up and recap the ground that we've covered. And again, as I said in my announcement that I recorded a few days ago, there will be moments in the slides when you'll turn to your elbow partner or to the people around you and engage in small group discussion. And when that happens, you don't need to pause the video because I have made some slides that have timers in them. So first, we define the field that we're engaging in. What is the ethics of media? In the same way that we summarized, and we did oversimplify the field of the ethics of war by posing a single question, we're going to try to get at the heart of this field, the ethics of media, by posing a single question, which gets to the heart of all issues that are discussed and written about in the ethics of media. And that question is basically, how should Christians use media? And if we want to have a more eloquent version, it's written on the screen here. How, if at all, should Christians use and interact with media in all its forms, from print media to electronic media to social media and every communication channel in between, in their everyday lives? Media are parts, inescapable parts of our everyday lives. So the question is really not whether we should use media, because we're already using them. The question is, how should we use these media as Christians? Having defined the field, we arrive at the first discussion activity. So turn to your elbow partner or form a group of 3 or 4 if you'd like. And I'd like you to do a think, pair, share activity. Now, before you discuss, listen to the instructions. First, you should spend probably 30 to 40 seconds thinking about your answer to these questions. Then in your pairs or in your groups, you'll share what you thought of, and each person should have an opportunity to speak. So make sure it's not just one person sharing their ideas. And here are the three questions. First, what kinds of media do you use every day? For me, it would be my smartphone. I check Instagram and Facebook every day, and I'm sad to admit I also use TikTok. It's a glorious waste of time, but I do check TikTok every day now. The second question is, why do you regularly use those media? I won't answer that question here. That's for you to think about and to share with your partner. And I'm too embarrassed to explain why I use TikTok. And the last question is, what are the positives and negatives, moral or otherwise? So you could think of moral positives and moral negatives, or you could think about, other kinds of positives and negatives, like practical ones, for example. What are the positives and negatives, moral or otherwise, of your use of those media? So the purpose of this Think, Pair, Share is to get all of you to think about the media that you interact with every day, and to think about why you interact with those media and whether there are goods and ills with your interactions with those media. So go ahead and take 5 minutes, and I'll start the timer now. I'll give you a chance to take a screenshot of this so that you can have the questions, because as the timer is going, you won't be able to go back to this slide. So go ahead and take your pictures now, and I'll wait a few seconds. Okay, that should be sufficient time to have taken a picture of the question. So take 5 minutes. Remember, think first for 30 to 40 seconds, and then engage in the pair or group sharing. Okay, time's up. I didn't expect the siren to ring, but I hope that you had a good discussion among yourselves about the media that you use. I hope that that discussion made you realize how pervasive and inescapable media use is in our everyday lives. Moving on to the next part of the lesson. So now that we have a deeper sense, or rather a refreshed sense of how we use media, why we use it, and we have some preliminary thoughts about whether there are goods and ills regarding our use of our media, the next question is, why should we as Christians even discuss this topic? Why should Christians discuss the ethics of media? Another way to put it is, why should members of the body of Christ reflect on questions of media in the 21st century? Now, I can't remember. Okay, yes, I was checking to see if there was a timer to see if I would put it to you to discuss. I do have some preliminary thoughts, but in the interest of fostering more discussion, which is the priority in a flipped classroom, I'll put the question to the class. So why do you think members of the body of Christ should reflect on questions of media in the 21st century? And take 3 minutes to discuss. I am not going to get used to those sirens. Sorry for using these timers. Okay, so let's come back together. Thank you for discussing that question with your elbow partner or your group mates. At this point, I'll let Pastor Rambu decide if he wants to pause the video and allow everyone to share some of what they discussed in their groups. And I'll pause so that he can decide if he's going to pause the video or not. Okay, and in any case, whether Pastor Rambo decided to pause the video or not, I think that the main answer to that question is that media is so ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it's such a pervasive and core part of our lives as Christians that we ought to have a biblical view on how we should use those media to glorify God, to advance the gospel, to build the church, to model Christ, and so on. Because as Christians, we cannot afford to just use media, but rather our use of media should always be prayerful and in worshipful reverence for our God. Oh, the timer's starting again. Okay. So we've answered the question of why we should think about the ethics of media, or we've begun to answer that question. Again, since we're just doing the introduction to media ethics, just the most foundational answers will suffice. We don't need to have an exhaustive take on why we should study Christian ethics, the Christian ethics of media. There are articles and books written on this subject. So if you'd like further reading, just reach out to me and I'd be happy to recommend more if this is too basic. But in any case, let's move on to the three major branches of our series on Christian ethics. And let's consider how each of these branches would approach the question of how Christians should use media. So the question for this part of the lesson is, what might Christian universalists, subversivists, and ecclesialists argue about the use or misuse of media? So remember again the three branches that we talked about last week and began to apply to the ethics of war. We're going to use the same branches to bear on our understanding of media. So these are the three approaches, and I've summarized some possible arguments from each approach in this chart. And again, these are just possible arguments. These aren't all of the arguments that might be raised within these branches of ethics. So let's start with the universal approach. From the universal approach, a Christian might argue that the church needs to embrace contemporary media if it wants to stay relevant, if the church wants to keep up with and meaningfully speak to a world of fast, prolific communication, then the church needs to embrace these media. Another argument that the universalist might make is that Christians should reform or redeem media by aligning them with God's truth. So the first argument in the universal box is kind of an argument that is basically an argument that focuses on right actions. It's an argument that focuses on, it's an argument that focuses on what is the reality in our world and how the church should engage with that reality. Excuse me about the right actions. It's been a long and eventful day at the annual gathering, so my brain is a little fizzled out. But the first argument is more of a pragmatic argument about the world that we live in and how the church should engage with that world. The second argument is more within the framework of right actions. Remember when we discussed deontological ethics, which is ethics based on duties that we owe to one another as moral agents. So the deontological ethicist A deontological argument would be the second bullet in the universal box, that we have a duty as Christians to reform media by aligning it with God's standard of truth. So that's two possible pathways for the universal approach. The subversive approach would ask questions and be more critical of our use and acceptance of media. One question that the subversivist may ask is, how do media, for example, how do films and TV shows reinscribe or challenge dominant cultural narratives of masculinity, femininity, and racial identity? So remember that gender and race are two of the major identity categories that play a significant role in subversive ethical arguments. So the subversive ethicist would look at media and think about how those media reinforce or challenge and pressure the stories that our culture tells about what it means to be manly or masculine, stories about womanhood, and stories about race. That's one possible path for the subversive approach. A second pathway would be to ask another question, which is whose voices are heard and told, and whose stories are silenced and not told in mass media, in films, TV shows, on the news, on the radio, and so on, whose voices, whose perspectives are heard and whose stories are not heard. And the answer to that question would be the argument in the second bullet point. Some voices are heard and some are silenced for nefarious political and social reasons. A third pathway for the subversive ethicist would be to ask, in a praxis-oriented vein, in an application-oriented vein, what role could new forms of digital technology play in the work of exposing and fighting or combating injustice at home and abroad? So in the same way that the universalist argues that media should be aligned with God's truth, in a similar way, the subversivist thinks in the third bullet point that digital technology plays a role in combating injustice. Whether in our local context or in an international context, media is a powerful tool for fighting injustice and should be used accordingly. The ecclesial approach would basically think about how Christians should engage with media, having fostered a Christian worldview in the context of the church. So again, ecclesial ethics is church-based, church-driven ethics. One argument that the ecclesialist might make about ethics is that Christians may engage with media in a morally permissible way, in a good way, basically, only if they enter the media arena with Bible-based convictions about what is good and just. So that argument kind of moves in two parts. The first part would be the only if part. So before Christians engage with media, they should have Bible-based convictions about what's good. For example, regarding the importance of truth and truth-telling. And the second part of the argument would be to bring those convictions to the media so that the convictions that exist a priori, the convictions that exist beforehand, will be like lenses through which the Christian engages with media. And let me check my battery. Okay, I do need to plug in sometime soon. But the second argument that the ecclesialist might make is that Christians is a more critical one. Christians should question whether what different forms of media offer as desirable or necessary is actually desirable or necessary. So the argument there is that Christians should question whether what media tell us we need or that we should want, whether we actually need or should want those things. So these are some potential arguments from the three major branches of Christian ethics that we've been relying on to organize our ethical arguments. And that brings us to the first question. So please discuss this question in groups. Which argument or arguments from that list do you agree with? And which argument or arguments do you disagree with? And the most important question, why? So again, in our ethical discussions, it's always gray. It's not black and white. There are no 100% right and 100% wrong answers. There are only persuasive and well-reasoned, well-articulated answers. So the question why is most important. So identify the argument or arguments you agree with, and then the argument or arguments you disagree with, and explain why. And we'll take, I think, 10 minutes to discuss this question. And here I have the slide again, so you can take a picture of the arguments, because while the timer is running, you won't be able to see all of the arguments. So take a moment to take a picture. At least one person in your group should take a picture. Okay, that should be enough time. And now we'll discuss those questions for 10 minutes. Again, which arguments do you agree with? Which do you disagree with? And most importantly, why? 10 minutes. All right, all right. Let's come back together, everyone. Thank you for discussing those questions. And again, at this point, I'll let Pastor Rambu decide, and also time willing, if he'll pause the video and invite folks to share the key takeaways from their group discussion. But after that point, I think that we'll begin to wrap up our lesson with a final think, pair, share. So now that you've discussed the potential arguments that would be raised from the universalist, subversivist, and ecclesialist perspectives, we'll do one more think, pair, share to connect those arguments with your own media practices. So here's the think, pair, share, and we'll take 5 minutes for this one. How can you use social media, Facebook, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, your smartphones, and so on, in a more God-glorifying, Christ-exalting, Spirit-led, and gospel-advancing way? So again, take a few seconds to think about it yourselves, and then with your elbow partner or your group, share what came to mind. And I don't have a timer for that. So just go ahead and pause this video and then do the think, pair, share for 5 minutes. Okay, assuming that the 5 minutes have now passed, we'll go ahead and wrap up with a brief summary of what we've covered. So we began by defining the field of the ethics of media by asking the main question that is at the heart of any exploration of the Christian ethics of media. And that question is, how should we as Christians use media in our everyday lives? Second, we, I'll need to think for a moment because the synapses are moving slowly at this point. Second, we, oops. I'm forgetting what we did secondly. Second, before we explored the three main branches of Christian ethics, I'm just going to look at the first slide. We asked a question of why we should discuss media. So that was the question of why we should even discuss the ethics of media as the body of Christ. And then we explored arguments or potential arguments from the three main branches of Christian ethics. And we evaluated these arguments, thinking about which ones are persuasive to us and which ones we disagree with. And lastly, we did a think, pair, share to connect our understanding of those arguments with our media practices. So we ended by thinking about how we can apply the insights of those arguments to our own media practices for the glory of God and for the good of our world, advancing the gospel of Jesus Christ. We've made it to the end of the lesson. I barely made it, but thank you for bearing with me. I decided to just push through the imperfections instead of recording an entirely new video. I may post a follow-up video for supplementary material on the ethics of media to dive deeper into this subject and to present other prominent arguments in the field. But for now, since we're just doing an introductory survey, I think that will suffice. Thank you for engaging with this topic, and a special thank you to Pastor Rambu for helping with the in-person facilitation. And again, I thank you for your patience. It has been a really, really memorable, but really tiring day at the annual gathering. I look forward to seeing everyone soon and telling you all about the experiences I've had and all the new friends that I've made from the conference. With that, I just want to summarize what we'll cover next week. So we've concluded our discussion of the ethics of media for now. And next week, we're going to discuss environmental ethics. So we may explore the ethics of climate change, how to care for God's creation, and how to live up to the command to be fruitful and multiply. So the question will basically, how can we be stewards of God's creation? If you have any questions about this lesson, you can feel free to text me anytime. I'm happy to take your questions and answer them as soon as I can. And of course, you can also ask Pastor Rambu if you have any questions, because I'm sure that he also has a well thought out view on how Christians ought to use their social media. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you for watching this video, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone soon.